Hello and welcome to episode 4 of Infinity N5 Mild Speculation, our content about content video series, where we go through and pontificate on new information that releases with regards to the new edition of Infinity, trying to investigate it and sort of puzzle out what the shape of the new edition might look like as best we can ahead of its actual release. Now, this week, Corvus Belli has just finished its usual one-week theme week partnership with OnTableTop, where they go through a number of things actually about the new edition, but these are usually done for the new sectorals or army boxes that are released. In this case, Kestrel and JSA Shinden Butai, which collectively are two of the three new sectorals for the new edition of Infinity. Now, although we will be touching on the new sectorals a little bit, that is not what this video is going to be primarily about because our picture for those sectorals is really still thoroughly incomplete. Instead, what we'll be going through here is a lot of the more concrete rules updates that have been released throughout the Infinity N5 week. And so we'll start by talking about the factions and armies that we'll be able to play in Infinity N5, but then we'll go through martial arts, guided missiles, super jump, sixth sense, and combat instinct, and then particularly importantly, the new fireteam rules. Now, what we will not be talking about is every new unit profile in detail, although at the end of the video I will have a slide on kind of why that is, and just a note about how to assess these profiles, particularly in the relative information vacuum that we're kind of still operating in. So just to begin with, we have on screen now all of the release factions for Infinity N5. With, as has kind of been forecast, the move of JSA to its status as primary faction, and the addition of Shinden Butai and JSA Oban as their sectorals, and then the removal of some sectorals from the game. So notably we have Neoterra, Varuna, Caledonia, and the Merovingian Rapid Response Force all leaving the game from the primary factions, as well as Starco, Forco, and Spiral Corps leaving the game from non-aligned armies. Now to note about Starco and Forco, although they are leaving the game, the named characters that formed the heart of those factions are being moved to other sectorals, probably nomad ones. Which means that if, for example, you are a Starco player, there is a pretty good chance you will be able to kind of reconstitute a fair bit of your army in a new home in a Nomad sectoral. In a very similar way, if you are a Varuna player, for example, now this is a little speculative, but if you look at the roster for generic Pan-Oceania, you will see a significant quantity of Varuna's like core troops, with the notable exception of the Motorized Light of Montesa. Basically everything else that really defined Varuna has made its way into generic Pan-Oceania. That includes things like Helots and Zulu Cobras, and of course Fusiliers and the Cutter, the Squalus Mark II, etc. These are all present, which means that if generic Pan-Oceania has suitable availabilities to make full use of those troops, we can kind of reconstitute a fair bit of Varuna's factional identity as a very strong, defensive, asymmetric faction in generic Pan-Oceania. So although Varuna as a sectoral is gone from the game, Varuna players should still be able to make quite a bit of use of their models and their troops, and recover some of that playstyle that made Varuna unique in comparison, for example, to Winterfall, by building a generic Pan-Oceanian list that focuses on Varuna troops. Now, we also know that quite a lot of factions are either receiving new troops or receiving a rework, or both. During theme work, Tartary Army Corps had some very interesting new troops showed off with their mechanized Antipode and their handler, as well as we know from the N5 book that's released that they are getting a new kind of artillery regiment, tractor mules with actual big mounted guns. We also know, of course, that both ISS and Onyx Contact Force are getting full Bakunin-style reworks, although we don't really have any idea of the shape of that, other than that Team Achilles will be in Onyx Contact Force. Now, with the release of this full list of factions that will be in N5, we obviously do have to note that, yes, some factions are gone from the game, and that is going to affect players who were particularly invested in those factions. Objectively speaking, I kind of agree with Corvus Belli's approach that it was important for the game to contract a little bit moving into a new edition, and I'm honestly not convinced it necessarily has contracted enough, but that's not really my judgment call to make. What is important, though, is that recognizing bloat kills wargames. You cannot expand infinitely both just from a production and sales kind of perspective, but also the barrier for entry to new players. Infinity, even in N5, is going to be a challenging game to leap into and try and figure out what it is that you want to play and what's going on with all of these different factions, trying to internalize all of the different rules and factional identities and the associated reduction in number of sectorals, but I think probably more importantly, the refinement of the generic slash vanilla armies identities down into a much more distilled and curated set of available profiles is very, very important for the overall health of the game. If you are a player of those factions that have been lost or removed from the game, though, it still really sucks. And as a particular note, pour one out for my boys Ed and Lockie. Ed was pretty much a dedicated Varuna and Spiral Core player. Now, it's not Ed's first rodeo, but that kind of sucks. And Lockie was probably the most high-fidelity Pan-Oceania player imaginable, which means that he could play all of the sectorals in great detail, and Pan-Oceania lost the most sectorals of any army. So it is a time that stings to kind of be those players. And at least for the next week or two, if you are talking to a Pan-Oceanian player, for example, who is maybe having a little bit of a down time, I would encourage a bit of sympathy, especially for those people who were not just a Winterfall player, but an all of Pan-Oceania player, because there has been a pretty significant reduction in what is available to those players. Now, from here, we're going to move on into the actual crunchy rules that have been shown off during the N5 week with OnTableTop, and talk a little bit about how they are designed and what they might mean for N5 as a game and the design philosophies in N5. And we're going to start with martial arts in N5, and this is one that I particularly like. You can see the martial arts in N5 table up there on the screen now. But to recap it just in general, at level 1, there's a -3 to your opponent's modifier. There's no change to damage. Damage is now just profile by profile. Your close combat weapon on your profile will have a damage or a probability of survival attribute, so they don't need to have martial arts including damage modifiers. That's just part of profiles now. So at level 1, you impose a -3 to the enemy. At level 2, in addition to getting a -3 to the enemy, you get a +3 to your own attack modifier. At level 3, in addition to the bonuses from level 2, you add 1 dice to your CC roll, but discard 1 dice of your choice after the roll. At level 4, you no longer have to discard the additional dice, you just get a flat +1 burst. And then at level 5, in addition to all of the previous bonuses, you get 1 more dice into the roll and then remove 1 afterwards. So at level 5, it is +3 to your attack modifier, -3 to your opponent's modifier, 2 extra dice, so 3 dice most of the time unless gang up bonuses are involved, and then discard 1 afterwards. Now, the overall takeaway here, before we get into which of these levels is best, is that every level is now a meaningful upgrade over the previous one, and that is a really big deal. Martial arts in N4 was a good skill to have, but basically all that mattered was, did you have martial arts level 2? Because that's the point at which you get a positive modifier to your own attack roll, which was a really big deal and is still a really big deal. In Infinity N4, it gave you a modifier to your die roll if you were above 20, so a 1 would become a 4 or a 7. Now you have the same effect mathematically, but it's just low die rolls are crits, same thing overall. That positive attack modifier is a big deal, but all of the subsequent levels are now also big deals. Going from martial arts level 2 to level 3 is an equally large breakpoint. Going from martial arts level 3 to level 4 is slightly less significant, but if you are in particular looking to beat up on durable non-CC experts, things like tags, martial arts level 4 is a big deal. And just to break that down, a martial art level 3 character is going to have a very, very good chance of winning the roll because they get to roll 2 dice and discard 1. That means they'll have a very high chance to crit, and if they don't crit, they still got a very high chance to at least, beat your roll, whatever your roll is. However, because you have to discard 1 dice after the roll, it means that the damage that you can do is going to be limited by however dangerous 1 hit from your close combat weapon is. And so this means that a martial artist level 3 is very, very likely to, for example, beat a tag in close combat, but they're probably going to need multiple orders to chew through the tag's armor and wounds because they're usually only succeeding, they're only inflicting 1 hit with their weapon, even if it's a DA weapon, for example, per order. Once you get to martial arts level 4, you start having a very meaningful chance to hit 2 attacks per order, even if your overall chance to win the face-to-face roll is no different. And then, of course, once you get to martial arts level 5, you just have gratuitous mastery. A martial artist level 5 is going to be fearsome in any close combat when we consider how the natural born warrior change works, right? Where natural born warrior no longer cancels out martial arts, it's just immune to the rival modifier. There is going to be basically no one in the game that Shinobu Kitsune, for example, does not strike fear into if she gets into close combat. So every level is a really big deal. Every level is a meaningful upgrade over the one previously, which means we are no longer just doing that. Do you have martial arts level 2? Great, you're a close combat dude. Check anymore, which is excellent. This is really smart design. It's really meaningful without actually adding any rules to the game, which is great. Speaking just anecdotally, I have a JSA player locally who is a friend of mine who has kind of drifted away from N4 a little bit because what appeals to them about JSA is being the martial artist and the good in close combat faction. And there were so many, oh, I have martial arts and a natural born warrior, your rules don't do anything, profiles in the game that they ran into over the course of N4 that they kind of just drifted away because the faction no longer fulfilled their fantasy. That's not only is that gone now, but like Shinobu and Musashi, if they get into close combat, which obviously is a big if because your opponent is going to be desperately trying to stop them from getting into close combat, but if they get into close combat, they are going to be unmatched. The maths on how even a martial arts level 3 character performs once they get into CC with something like a Fusilier or a Tag is genuinely fearsome. And once you hit that martial arts level 5, you are going to win. Like the odds of a failure are not 0, because Infinity does have crit rules, etc. But the odds of winning a face-to-face roll and also decisively defeating your opponent with martial arts level 5, especially, which is a very rare skill, are very, very high. And so what this means is that overall, the changes to martial arts in Infinity N5 are excellent. I do not expect getting into close combat to necessarily be any easier than it is in N4, but the rewards for doing so, particularly if you do so with a high expertise level trooper, is going to be a really big deal. Excellent change. Let's move on to the next one. So here we have 2 rules that have both received small changes / clarifications, so we're just going to cover them on one slide. The first is guided missiles, and the second is, what does that jet propulsion rule that we saw on a profile mean? So with guided missiles, we now have confirmation that the nerf to guided missiles that we expected to see in Infinity N5 rather, is that you can reset as a face-to-face roll against a guided attack. So what this means is that if a guided missile attacks one of your troopers that has the targeted state on them, you can make a reset roll, and that reset is face-to-face against the enemy guided missile ballistic skill attack. And if you succeed on the reset, we know that clearing Spotlight targeted something that happens on a successful reset roll. We assume that will be the same in Infinity N5. Now, we don't know absolutely that there will be a -3 penalty to reset, but it is very likely that there will, even if there is still a -3 penalty to resetting against the targeted state in Infinity N5. That will still be, for most troops, a better face-to-face roll than trying to dodge. Your average trooper, like Fizz 10 and Willpower 13, trying to dodge a missile attack would have been dodging on 7s or resetting on 10s and copying the hit. Now they get to reset on 10s, it's a materially better number, and gives you a fairly clean way to respond. Just this is the correct way, generally speaking, to respond to guided missile attacks. Now, it is worth noting that this is overall a relatively gentle nerf, which does very slightly reduce the lethality of guided missiles because a lot of troops will have a better face-to-face roll with their resets. But kind of more importantly, what it does is significantly increase the risk that a guided missile attack will be too order intensive to be practical if it's the first thing that you try. And what I mean by this is that guided missiles, kind of the role that they are meant to play in Infinity, is that they are a way of breaking through a deadlock when you can't fight symmetrically, right? Where you can't just bring up a big gun and shoot the enemy thing, perhaps because the enemy is hiding or they're dug in very heavily behind tall cover and you can't actually get physical shots into them, or because they just have too powerful a defensive piece that trying to engage it would result in your defeat most of the time, right? Things like guided missiles and speculative fire are they are the tools that Infinity offers, among others, for getting around these deadlocked positions. And so having that ability to fight asymmetrically against strong, symmetric, hard ARO defenses is really valuable to the way that Infinity plays, but it can't be so powerful that it is necessarily the always optimal way to play against that kind of defense. Now, whether or not it was always optimal is a matter of some discussion. You will see people who think that Guided was much, much too strong in Infinity N4, it was too easy to use, it carried too little risk, etc. Regardless of your opinion on that, one of the risks that using guided missiles carried in N4 was that it was just going to be very, very order intensive. You were unlikely to have to risk troopers particularly often, and there were some exceptions. For example, someone making a run with a heckler to place a fast panda, right? They don't need to roll for the fast panda, but a heckler is not always an easy troop to get that close to your opponent to be able to place the fast panda without the heckler itself becoming a casualty. That was the counterplay to that kind of attack. Now, I expect that to still be the case in N5, but even in the case of the heckler run, the actual risk that is being borne by the Nomad player making the guided missile attack in that case is just that it will take many, many orders. You have to move the heckler forward, you have to place the fast panda, you have to spotlight, which might take multiple rolls, then you have to land the guided missile attacks, which might take multiple rolls, all to kill one trooper, then you have to do it all again to kill a second trooper, or do it mostly again to do a second trooper, depending on how your opponent is deployed and whether they've allowed you to catch multiple models inside a single repeater area. That risk, right, that you might just blow your entire order stack to kill one or two things, still exists in N5, but it's even higher now, because if your opponent successfully resets against a guided missile attack, now you have to go all the way back to the apply spotlight step and reapply spotlight, which they'll be resetting against without penalty because they've cleared the state, and before you can then go and start launching missiles again. And so for those guided missile enjoyers, the risk calculus of whether or not this is the way I should play the first attack on my first turn probably changes a little bit. Now, I would expect there to still be invert guided missile enjoyers that are like, no, I am going to put pitches on your deployment zone and attack you with missiles the first turn because I like using missiles, and that's fine. But their win rates will come down because that kind of attack becomes inherently less reliable. So when we look at sort of competition level play and the competition meta game, it won't necessarily change quickly, but we will almost certainly, particularly in like 5-round events, see players using that kind of strategy exclusively fall off in terms of win rate. Because especially over a 5-round event, hitting that failure state that just blows out your entire first turn, spending all of your orders for very little effect, is almost certainly going to materialize, or at least will materialize more often. The second rule on this slide is just clarification around what jet propulsion means, which we saw super jump jet propulsion in the Kestrel Banshee profile, which is the drop troop for Kestrel Force. And what's been clarified here is that jet propulsion is just true three-dimensional movement. It's super jump, and it's truly three-dimensional. You can move to and from your starting position however you would like, etc. Just to note, there is a strong reading of the rules for Super Jump in Infinity N4 that says this is how you play Super Jump. I've had this argument previously. Suffice to say, I am used to playing Super Jump this way, but it is very suitable for models that, for example, are vehicles or drones that are meant to have flight-like propulsion without, and this is the important thing, without putting flight as its own rule into Infinity N5. In basically every wargame that has ever tried to introduce true flight as a mechanic, it has been, at least initially, an absolute hot mess, wildly overpowered, wildly useless, whether this has been things like Conquest with its aerial rule that was subsequently cut before it made it into final release, or Flyers in 40k, etc. Wargamers tend to approach, oh, you're adding flying things with some trepidation, and not without historic precedent. So super jump jet propulsion is the way that super jump on those models with jet propulsion, like the Banshee, but also presumably things like the vehicles and drones will behave, and it's just a nice sensible way of handling those things. We know that the vehicles will kind of all be silhouette 7, a little bit of a flying base, but how they will actually move is as a super jumping model at the end of each order, pulling back down to kind of hug behind cover, even if they can't actually take cover, which we know they can't, but effectively playing very much like any other Infinity model and not fundamentally breaking the movement paradigm of the game in any way, and importantly, without really adding any new rules to the game, which I am a fan of. Now, just as another point of mild speculation, I would note that the addition of this to the Banshee is also potentially a very interesting telegraph. And that's because the Banshee does not look any different to basically every other drop troop. It's got the same jump packs that every Pan-Oceanian drop troop, the Santiago, the Crusader Brethren, the Akal Commando, etc. has had. And those models have very often been depicted in these like flying around kind of poses. That's super common for Infinity drop troops. But with only a couple of exceptions, very, very few Infinity drop troops have actually had anything resembling super jump. That's been a rare skill on drop troops. Can we guess, and I think it's fairly likely, that drop troops will now be getting that kind of jet propulsion super jump as a rule because they literally have a flying backpack, and why can't they do something that is kind of flying like? And so, along with what appears to be a somewhat aggressive recosting of super jump as a skill in N5, sorry, not super jump, drop troop as a skill in N5, it seems to be relatively cheap based on the Banshee profile. That is a potentially very positive development for anyone that wants to or has historically enjoyed using drop troops. If they get super jump jet propulsion, just as a rule on most of them, because they literally have jetpacks on their back, and if they're not kind of like so expensive that the risk of having them off the board and then maybe not landing is unbearable because the rule is just cheaper, we could see in N5 a lot more of those dynamic play pieces, which would be really interesting. Now, that is absolutely just speculation, but if a Banshee has super jump jet propulsion, I do not see any reason why every other model wearing that kind of a backpack wouldn't potentially also get it. Now, up next, we have one old rule that has been split into two new rules, and that is the Infinity N4 Sixth Sense rule, which has now been split into Sixth Sense and Combat Instinct. Combat Instinct is a rule that we've seen appear on a couple of profiles in Kestrel and Shinden Butai so far. Now, Sixth Sense has two effects. The first is that it allows you to respond to attacks through zero visibility zones without a -6 modifier, and it allows you to dodge without any negative modifiers. I want to just kind of call that second bit out there because those people who have played Infinity N4 will know that Sixth Sense in N4 has this weird kind of prerequisite to get your benefit effect, which is that in N4, Sixth Sense has the requirement you must be attacked, which means that an opponent just walking through your zone of control, if you have Sixth Sense, making that zone of control dodge still imposes a -3 to your dodge roll because you can't see the person that's provoking the ARO. Just kind of rules as written, based on the slide that says allows its possessor to dodge without any negative modifiers. If that is now a catch-all and it does not have the requirement of being attacked, then Sixth Sense now works a bit more flexibly with regards to making your dodge rolls. I don't know, that's just speculation. We don't know how the rule is actually structured, but they have chosen to present it that way on the slide, and personally that is something that I would like. Zone of control dodges are generally a fairly dynamic and interesting part of the N4 experience, but sort of more importantly, explaining that specific interaction to newer people who have gone, oh, I have a tiger creature and it has this rule. What do you mean I don't get to use the rule? The rule says I don't suffer a negative to my dodge. No, 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 but you're not being attacked. But the rule says that kind of interaction sucks and I don't like them, and getting rid of that interaction in N5 and just being like, hey, do you have Sixth Sense? You always dodge without any negative modifier. That would be a nice, clean rules change. Again, adding something to the game without actually adding more rules. Now, Combat Instinct, after Sixth Sense, Combat Instinct is now the rule that allows you to ignore negative modifiers from surprise attack. And as we will see on the next slide, Combat Instinct is not a rule that Fireteams get. Sixth Sense is, right? So at the highest level of bonuses, Fireteams will get Sixth Sense, which is the dodge without negatives and be able to respond back through zero visibility zones. But Combat Instinct is not going to be native to Fireteams, which means that, although you might have troopers in a Fireteam with Combat Instinct as a rule on their profile, Surprise now works against Fireteams, which is personally, I would say, a wonderful change because that is a good rule that has just not actually done anything much of the time in Infinity N4 because of how easy it is to get access to Sixth Sense on those link teams and how those link teams tend to comprise a relatively large portion of your opponent's meaningful elements that you have to overcome to progress the game state. Now, in terms of what we don't know how either of these skills interacts with stealth. Typically speaking, stealth will have a little rule that says this is not effective against troopers with the skill. Whether that's Sixth Sense or Combat Instinct or both or neither, we don't know. I would speculatively expect one or the other to still be effective against stealth as part of how stealth works, and I would kind of expect it probably to be Sixth Sense. But that is something to look out for when we are assessing profiles and as more information comes out with regards to the rules. Now, one other small thing to note is that when Combat Instinct was first shown off, given the profiles that it was on, a lot of people were wondering, oh, is this just a rebranding of Tactical Awareness? Obviously, no, it's not, now that we know what Combat Instinct does. But what that does mean is that we have not yet seen a profile of any of the new releases with tactical awareness, even though some of them are the kind of profiles that you might expect to see that rule on. Now, this does not mean, for example, that tactical awareness is being removed from the game, but it may mean that Corvus Belli is being more cautious handing it out, because it does kind of feel like that rule was handed out like candy over the course of N4. And reining in how many extra orders you can squeeze into a list, like, yes, we have seen NCO and Lieutenant +1 order on the Shinden Butai profile, so obviously that interaction still exists. But if there is going to be a slight reining in of how many extra orders we can cram into a 15 trooper list, I would kind of like that. And now, at last, here's the big one. Fireteams in N5. The not necessarily full, but nearly full rules, importantly the bonuses and way we do composition, etc., for fireteams in the new edition. Now, as I and many others had previously speculated, how this is going to work is that you derive your bonuses from how many troops of that fire team are present, and extra troopers outside of that fire team type don't interact with how many bonuses you get, but they do benefit from those bonuses, and importantly, they don't break composition like they do in N4. N4 had this kind of, in retrospect, sort of archaic system where you had to first check for purity and then count two different bonus sort of tracks. That was unwieldy. It worked, but it was unwieldy. This is much cleaner. And so these bonuses are in order with just one trooper of the fire team type. So for example, a 5-person Fusilier team that contains one Fusilier that just has the usual fire team bonus of all units activate with a single order. Once you have 2 Fusiliers in that link team, whether it is a 2-person Fusilier team, a duo, well, you can't make Fusilier duos except maybe in vanilla, but we'll get back to that. A two Fusilier fire team, so that could be an Orc and something else and 2 Fusiliers. Then you get +1 burst, but 1 die is removed after the roll. Now, unlike martial arts, which has 2 different levels and like lots of different interactions with how many dice you get, in the fire team bonus rules, this is the only way to get any additional burst. It happens at 2 troopers of the link type, and you will always have that 1 dice is removed after the roll effect. Now, unlike with martial arts, where you are rolling such high quality dice, for want of a better term, in fire teams, I would say +1 burst, discard the lowest, is most of the time going to be relatively indistinguishable, probabilistically, from +1 burst. There will be circumstances where it matters, but if you think about making a 5 dice attack with a linked heavy machine gun, you are almost always going to have 1 die in that burst that either was a miss or was cancelled out by one of your opponent's rolls. So it's going to be, especially in cases like that, pretty negligibly different. It will matter when you're making those 2 die attacks, but even then, like making AROs with stuff like linked missile launchers, the most important thing was just that you won the face-to-face roll. Even 1 hit with a missile launcher is a big deal. This is now going to mean that the absolute most catastrophic for your opponent rolls with your fire teams, with those things like linked missiles and linked snipers, are going to be marginally less catastrophic, right? That double crit with a missile launcher is now just going to be a single crit with a missile launcher, which is still devastating, but it isn't 8 saves on your tag. But in most cases, you can really think of this as really very similar to just +1 burst. Level 3 is +3 willpower to discover rolls and +1 fizz to dodge rolls. That's quite nice. It actually means that close combat or any fire team that is attempting to make multiple use of dodges, etc., that's just sort of nice to have. This is probably the weakest overall jump in terms of the mechanical bonuses that you get. But even here, both of those are meaningful, and there are many occasions where having +3 willpower to discover rolls, particularly for something like a Pan-Oceanian team, but really in any case, is a nice thing to have. At level 4, we get +1 ballistic skill. And once again, this is the only source of ballistic skill bonus that we will see across all of the fire teams. A ballistic skill 13 trooper goes to 14, a 14 goes to 15. No more ballistic skill 18, 17 troopers in links. We get +1 BS at level 4. That's very nice to have. It is a meaningful bonus, but that's all that you get out of your link teams. And then at level 5, you get Sixth Sense, which, as we saw, no longer renders you immune to surprise, but does still allow you to respond to attacks through 0 visibility zones with no penalty, and allows you to dodge without penalty. Now, things that we don't know is how this works with templates and disposable weapons. I've seen quite a few things bandied around that are kind of on the "my uncle works at Nintendo" level of rumor. Oh yes, Carlos said that. Oh, where did he say that? Oh, hang on, my Warcore told me that he said that. Let me track that down. Okay, cool. Can you track that down? No. All right, cool. And so very difficult as such to really rely on, but kind of speculatively, if you were to tell me, yes, it has been confirmed that templates don't benefit from this at all, I would be totally unsurprised. What we see here is a broad depowering of fire teams, and if link teams still had like full benefit extra burst templates with no penalty, which they would, rules as written, right? Like if I say a direct template weapon gets +1 burst but removes 1 die after the roll, all that means is the direct template weapon gets +1 burst, because a direct template weapon does not roll dice. So therefore, if you tell me, oh, actually, look, just direct template weapons don't get any benefit, don't get any burst benefit from fire teams, that is pretty much in line with the broad design philosophy, which is to reduce both the brick wall and Death Star effect that some fire teams could have. Fire teams are still going to be very, very useful, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, but they are not necessarily going to be the entire concentrated nature of your force, or the piece around which the entire game revolves in kind of a pass-fail kind of way. Now, the very important takeaway here is that much like martial arts, all levels of fire team have incremental but measurable benefits, provided you've got at least 2 troopers of the fire team type, which will be pretty easy to do. This means that fire teams are going to be more flexible in Infinity N5, but they're probably going to be less overtly powerful, and that's very much a design goal. Now, in talking about the implications of the fire team change, realistically, there are still too many unknowns for us to fully unpick this, but I think we can be fairly optimistic. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, a major overall change is that all levels of fire team are now viable. Anything from duo up to full 5-person teams represents a small but incrementally increasing bonus. Now, it is going to be very tempting to assess these rules relative to the old ones and think about how your army has lost power in the new edition. But instead, I would suggest considering, just in a vacuum, are each of these bonuses appealing to make use of? And the answer is yes, in all cases. Every level of bonus that you get from a fire team represents a material improvement to the troopers that are composing the link, which is good, which means you will want to make use of fire teams, which means fire teams are a strength of armies that have access to interesting ones. It is going to be tempting to assess whether your faction is affected by this, and that's fine, but when you do so, don't just sit and think about how the lists you're running right now in N4 would work with these changes to the bonuses against other lists in N4 that don't have the bonuses changed. And that's going to be something that people will do, right? People will say, oh, my current N4 Invincible Army list is no longer going to be as good if I imagine it playing against an Infinity N4 generic Nomad list that doesn't use fire teams. I've been depowered as a result. And when we sort of spell it out like that, that's kind of ridiculous, but people will do it anyway. It is important to remember that N5 will be a different game. Generic factions will be more constrained. They won't have access to the entire panoply of profiles that they currently do. They will have more refined identities. And all sectorals will have had the same adjustment to fireteam strengths. And if we think about it, the fact that sectorals will be able to run multiple duos might now be a powerful incentive to play a sectoral, because even duos are good. And again, if you're going to make this kind of assessment as to how your faction might play in the new edition, at least stop and think about what your fireteam charts might look like in the new edition. For example, if you are one of the many Toha players that has said, this nerfs Toha, because you just think about the current Toha fireteam setup, imagine how Toha will run if every fireteam member just has the Triad tag. You have McCalls counting as Triad members, you have Sukeyas counting as Triad members. That would actually still be, technically speaking, a relative depowering of Toha Link teams moving into the new edition. They are objectively less powerful, but only in exactly the same way that everyone else's fire teams are objectively less powerful. And you shouldn't, as Toha, thinking about how they are meant to play, have to jump through too many hoops. You are meant to be able to build flexible three-person links that get some benefits to being in a link, and I would expect these benefits to include +1 dice discard one of your choice, +0 power to discover, and +1 fizz to dodging. Now, that said, obviously, yes, there are not going to be some obvious and simple N4 tactics that translate. Like, not everything from N4 will translate into N5, and a big one that we can probably say farewell to is paramedics and engineers in links. This is because these are really good in N4, because if you score 2 hits with a +1 burst Medidart, even a Fizz 10 Fusilier has 2 rolls at a 10, which is a 75% chance to stand back up, which is significantly better than a Panoshianian Doctor. That's not going to work anymore, because your Medidarts will be roll 2 dice, discard 1, which means you're only ever succeeding with 1 hit, which means that paramedics will still be useful for all of the reasons the paramedics are currently useful. But if you spend that 2 points to upgrade a Fusilier to a paramedic, you are getting a 50% chance that one order will resurrect a Fusilier, and that's all, not a 75% chance. This means that linked paramedics aren't going to be the go-to force reconstitution tool for most factions, and you will need to think about, do you want paramedics? Are you like Ariadne with very high fizz? Or maybe do we want doctors if we want to actually seriously recover things like that black air that we've put in a link with the Fennec Fusiliers? I would also encourage people to think not necessarily just about link teams, but how troopers that they have in their armies, independent operators, might work now that fire teams have been adjusted. And a really big one that stands out to me is intruders. Intruders in N4 have had a very rough time of it, because linked AROs were were probably the most common kind of ARO, and neither an intruder's surprise or ability to inflict penalties through zero visibility attacks did anything against your average 5-person link team, which meant that intruders really just weren't necessarily usable relative to their very high cost as that kind of suppression piece of enemy AROs. Now, a 5-person link team that has full 5-person bonuses, which is going to be rare, will still have the ability to respond back through a zero visibility zone without a -6. But firstly, that's going to be rare, and secondly, surprise will still work. And so we can kind of ask the question, okay, I've spent an entire edition pining for intruders after enjoying them a lot in N3. Are they back in the spotlight now? And so when assessing your faction, think about all of the tools that you have, the stuff that you currently maybe don't use and which might see more play. Just a lot is going to change as a result of the fire team changes. And overall, I'm kind of a big fan of all of that. Now, this is the most sort of speculative part of this slide, but just kind of to note, I am personally hoping that the fire team changes are part of a broad depowering of many of the sort of the strongest things in N4. And in particular, I think this includes tags. Now, I like using tags, but I like using tags because they're powerful. I like using powerful things. And I think tags are presently in N4 fun and strong, but a little too easy to put into a list, especially the 15 trooper limit in N4 and that will persist into N5, makes that kind of just, I get an extra order, and I get a very, very big gun, and I use only a single troop slot, and by the way, there's a specialist inside that. You get a lot, not just for the points, but for the use of the troop slot, and I would like to see more trade-offs involved in getting tags into lists. Now, there are a number of ways that that could be done. Maybe they will lose tactical awareness. Maybe we will see limited cover be a rule that applies to tags. Maybe we'll see neither, and maybe just sort of their points will stay the same and nothing will change. but they are a unit that I would like to see the role change from the current, like, cheap, relatively cheap, very effective firepower dominance piece to maybe something kind of different. A tag is meant to occupy the role of tank in Infinity, and tanks are most interesting in a wargaming perspective when they operate as part of a force mix with infantry support and supporting infantry. And you can play tags that way in N5, but the N4 rather, but the fact that a tag in N4 is kind of a do everything piece is something that I wouldn't mind see changing. That is, however, purely speculative, and I have no special information other than we haven't seen tactical awareness on any profile yet, and we do know that limited cover is a rule that's going to exist along with no cover. Now, just to close this video out, I want to talk a little bit about thinking about these new profiles through what I call the parable of the Shakush. We've seen a lot of new profiles for Kestrel Colonial Force and JSA Shinden Butai, and frankly, the JSA Shinden Butai profiles all have big close combat bloat energy, but there are some pretty interesting things in there. The Kestrel profiles in particular seem very strong, and I want to just mention similar experiences that people who played in N3 into N4 will have had, especially the Shakush tag. Now, when the Shakush dropped, it actually dropped in late N3. We knew N4 was on the way. We knew that the Shakush would be a tag that was going to be sort of like front and center part of N4 design philosophies, but nevertheless, when it arrived, popping in at 58 points with its HMG, etc., in comparison to other tags in the game at the time, it appeared wildly efficient and borderline overpowered. You could, and we did, compare it to every other tag and go, wow, this thing's incredible. And time has made an absolute mockery of that assessment. How is the Shakush in late N4? It's mid as hell. Now, I mention this because especially things like the Banshees, the Black Air, and Scarecrows seem really, really good, especially when we compare them, the Banshee and the Scarecrow in particular, we compare them to other troops of their type. The Banshee is an aggressively costed combat jump troop, the Scarecrow is an aggressively costed hidden deployment troop. And although we know, for example, boarding shotguns and submachine guns, weapons that are on the Scarecrow, are all receiving light nerfs as they move into N4, N5, the fact that the Scarecrow is native ballistic skill 13 and every profile sits comfortably below 30 points is a really big deal. Like, that is aggressively, solidly costed. But if we stop and think about hidden deployment and combat jump in Infinity N4 and parachutists, etc., all of those skills that require a unit to start off the table and not contribute its order to the pool, like, I am reluctant to use basically all of those skills in N4 because on the first turn, having the maximal possible quantity of orders is a big deal because it maximizes my turn 1 offense or my ability to survive a turn 1 attack and then subsequently counter assault. And the fact that combat jump troops especially need to use their order to arrive on the battlefield and don't necessarily always arrive where you want them to, means that there's a lot of risk for quite a high investment, both in terms of points and combat group slots. I would speculate that the Banshee and the Scarecrow are both probably going to be, probably still quite efficient profiles, but more representative of how rules like these are costed in N5 kind of generally. So yes, although I look at the Scarecrow in an N4 context and I think that's an excellent hidden deployment model, it is very possible that in fact hidden deployment will just be better in Infinity N5 because it costs less to be a MIM6 hidden deployment infiltrating camouflage trooper. And so that itself would be a paradigm shift. And at the conclusion of that paradigm shift, we'll be able to look back and say, okay, well, how does the Scarecrow stand up in terms of the broad metagame around pieces that have hidden deployment? And we can say at that point either, oh no, yes, it's still really quite good, or it's pretty solid, or somewhere between the two. Now, yes, as a little bit of an exception, the Black Air neurokinetics profile does seem kind of cooked. And it is, I would observe, a very Corvus Belli design philosophy thing to do, to say, we are going to make it so that link teams are less of a brick wall and are more easy to overcome. Yes, we've done that. Good job. Now let's put a neurokinetics, multispectral visor level 2, mimetism, combat instinct, ballistic skill 13, linkable with Fennec Fusiliers profiles straight into the game, and let players beat their freaking heads against that for the entire early edition. Now, the Black Air is just a single wound profile. There are ways to deal with single wound profiles. If nothing else, you just shoot it until it falls down. It's not the end of the world. We also don't 100% know for sure that neurokinetics is going to translate directly as currently is into Infinity N5. There is every possibility that neurokinetics will change to be something like this model is burst 2 in ARO, for example. And maybe that will be written in a way that doesn't stack with link team bonuses. But certainly, prima facie, yes, it is a more than 30-point profile for a model with a single wound, but it is pretty fearsome as part of ARO pieces go, even with just a couple of Fusiliers behind it. And so, even though, generally speaking, I would caution wishlisting and wild optimism, I have seen at least one person assume that the silenced pistol on the Scarecrow imposed an additional -6 to the attack rolls that the Scarecrow was making, and so told me straight-faced that the Scarecrow, based on their testing, was an excellent midfielder because of its ability to impose a -15 to the enemy in face-to-face rolls. I do think there's probably pretty reasonable grounds for being optimistic about the Black Air, and maybe thinking about how you might solve for the Black Air when you inevitably play against Kestrel Colonial Force in the new edition. And so, with that cautionary tale with the parable of the Shakush, we're going to wrap up this video. That concludes mild speculation number 4, looking back at OnTableTop Infinity N5 Theme Week. The next one of these will come out the next time we have some kind of a meaningful information drop that is worth speculating on, or which is not worth speculating on, but many people are speculating anyway. That's a secondary thing that will motivate me to try and make some content. As always, if you'd like to support the channel and like the videos that I do, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has so far, it makes videos like this possible. In terms of future content, I am still working on the How to Survive Edition Change and How to Play in an Early Edition Change metagame video. That will come out approximately when it's ready, and we'll probably do more faction focuses between now and the release of N5, which at time of recording is pretty much exactly 1 month away. If you have any content that you're interested in seeing, especially immediately after the new edition drops, I'd be very interested in hearing about that, whether that is faction impressions, tier lists, hot takes, anything like that. Please do let me know. And otherwise, I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time.